Hello, comrades. Welcome to this evening's online communist forum, jointly organised between the Communist Party of Great Britain and Labour Party Marxists. My name is Andy, and I will be facilitating the meeting this evening. The meeting has been billed as a discussion between Roxy Hall of the Bolshevik Tendency and Mike Macnair of the Communist Party of Great Britain on the question of Marxism and transliberation. Unfortunately, Roxy is unable to join us this evening, so we will be having a meeting to explore an initial exploration of this subject, and we hope to reschedule a meeting with Roxy at some point in the future. There will be the usual opportunities for questions and contributions after Mike's introduction. Can I ask if you would like to make a contribution or ask a question at the end of Mike's introduction, if you use the raise hand function, which is under reactions in your Zoom window. And with no further ado, I will pass over to Mike Macnair.
Thank you, Andy. Just to kick off on this, it was, as Andy said, it was intended to be a discussion with Roxy Hall, but she can't come because her partner's been taken into hospital for emergency surgery, which is an understandable reason not to be, a perfectly good reason not to be available. That affects what I'm doing. Yasmin is going to put up in the chat, I think, a link or a document which I've sent round. What I'm going to talk to is something actually relatively limited. I have the document which Yasmin is going to put up has a list. I did a series of 6 articles on this subject in February, March 2023 in the paper Weekly Worker, and then another one under the title Yet More Lies, addressed to the Conservative Party's anti-trans culture war campaign a couple of months after that. And then more recently, in response to the partyist website putting up Roxy Hall's 10 Theses and to critical comments on CPGB by Brunhilde Olding of the Australian Revolutionary Communist Organisation. I wrote a piece in the paper a couple of months ago. And one of the things which came out of that was the question of the maximum program. I'm going to talk a bit more about the maximum program and then why we have to address the question of transliberation in terms of the maximum program rather than primarily in terms of the minimum program. And then I think also that my third item is going to be a little bit about theoretical arguments and reasons for rejecting certain sorts of theoretical arguments. So the Max program, I start with an anomalous thing. This is a story from science fiction. Lois McMaster Bujold is a science fiction author who, among other things, writes space opera, which plays with new reproductive and life technologies. So she's concerned with a whole load of different extents of one sort and another. And the space opera aspect of it has the very common science fictional trope of the lost colony, which has reverted to some sort of feudalism and is now reintegrating itself in the modernist galactic civilization. And in the episode in question, in the book A Civil Campaign, which I've given the page reference to in the document, Lord Ivan goes to the spaceport to meet, as he thinks, Lady Donna. But it turns out that Lady Donna has gone off planet to have a sex change operation, and who comes and meets him is Lord Dono. And for the purposes of the plot, it's essential to Lord Dono inheriting from his brother um, that he should be male, and moreover, actually, that he should be fully functional, fertile male. So we get the story of the um, circumstances. The idea is to keep their cousin, who is thought to have persecuted the brother until such time that the brother died under dubious circumstances, to keep the cousin out of the inheritance. So Lord Dono therefore has to inherit, and in order to inherit, he has to have a sex change operation, which is going to give him fully functional genitals, including fertility. Mm. And the question which is posed by that as an image, an idea, is would the people who object to, say, trans women are not women, trans men are not men, still say of the character Lord Dono in Bujold's book, that Lord Dono is not a man, in spite of the fact that Lord Dono has a perfectly functional set of genitals, which is capable of fathering children. Same, we can imagine the circumstances. We can easily imagine the circumstances reversed. It happens to be the case that Bujold's narrative in this Vorkosigan story, this is that the universe is called the Vorkosigan universe. The fact that Lady Donna becomes Lord Dono is significant to the plot in ways which I don't propose to go into. Yeah. Um, in a sense, this is a science fictional plot. It's not uh, science fictional like it's not, and it's sort of set centuries in the future in a galaxy spanning human civilization. Um, as space opera characteristically is, it's not playing with gender in the same way as Samuel R. Delaney's Triton, in which the central character takes a pill which gives him a sex change to a woman, and um, Delaney plays with gender issues, as Delaney actually does in quite a lot of his fiction. Um, but it's but that's just a fantasy thing, because the reason why I say this just a not just a fantasy thing is because, in spite of the fact that Bujold sets her story centuries in the future, um, uh, in fact, growing organs out of the body for transplantation purposes, is present day science. And uh, fallopian tubes have been grown in miniature, testicles have been grown in miniature for research purposes, vaginal tissue has been grown for transplantation purposes for women who have some sort of medical problem. Um, uh, uh, Ovaries have been grown, or claim Harvard researchers claim that they can grow ovaries. And a story about 10 years ago that the guys in researchers of growing penises in vitro. So uh, we're not actually all the way there yet, but this stuff is not just long durée future um, considerations, but probably decades away rather than centuries away. I'm cautious, but probably decades away rather than centuries away. And the question, to be honest, I think that in reality, um, the people who the so-called trans-exclusionary radical feminists or alternatively gender-critical feminists would still regard that as being problematic, in spite of the fact that the result, if the technology is there, the result is going to be somebody who is fully functional for reproductive purposes as well as um, for sexual purposes, and indeed also that in terms of the endocrinal um, patterns, it needs the other side of it, which I've also put in. There's progress in genetic engineering because um, Lady Donna's turn into Lord Dono in Buchholz's book requires not just growing a set of male genitals, but also growing a set of male genitals which is fully compatible for transplantation and getting a Y chromosome from somewhere. And the Y chromosome is got in the story from her deceased brother, from genetic samples from her deceased brother. So it involves genetic engineering as well as in vitro cloning, in vitro cloning organs. Mm. Um, and it's the strength, it seems to me, of Comrade Hall's uh, uh, 10 theses on transliberation and of the Marxist Unity Group's transliberation text, um, which I critiqued the um, in the August article, that they address that sense of possibility, the maximum program under socialism, full socialism, indeed, actually, quite probably more before full socialism, under socialism is possible, under communism is possible to have what would in reality be a full effective sex change. And I do not think that there would be satisfactory justification for denying that a person who was turned from a woman into a man or from a man into a woman was not a man or not a woman under those circumstances. Naomi Sheeman coined the expression in 1997 that you might want to distinguish between women who are, as they talk about trans women and cis women, but cis women are, quote, perinatally pinked, um, as referring to the fact that there's a whole raft of experience of oppression um, which is not shared by people who grow up as boys. Um, are not taught to be quiet and neat and tidy and so on and so forth. So that that sense that there is an issue, political issue there, but it's a political issue uh, which the gender critical feminists don't, in substance, satisfactorily address. Um, my second so my first point about that is that in terms of the maximum program, it's not, I can't see any strong reason, we have at the moment resources for plastic surgery of all sorts, reconstructive surgery of all sorts. uh, um, I see no reason why not, from the point of view of communism, why we should oppose this in principle. If we were going to oppose it in principle, we'd have to be opposing it on the basis of a principle of retro naturalism, of a politics of nostalgia. Then there's a logic which goes along with that, which is a step further in a sense, which is that the we can put it in two ways. One of which is, um, suppose that when we say a man, we mean a person who has male genitals, including functional uh, testicles and the ability to engender children. And when we say we mean a woman, we mean a woman, somebody who has a vagina and and ovaries and or womb and so on, capable of becoming pregnant and bearing children. And I think this is an important one because in reality, a lot of the discrimination that women face arises out of the risk of pregnancy and out of the primary responsibility of children, of women for children in their infant years. Um, it's the moment at which there are children, at which in the patterns of behaviour, the there is a tendency for the housework to fall on the woman as well as for the childcare to fall on the woman, etc., etc. The presence of children is the thing which shifts from egalitarian marriage, egalitarian male-female heterosexual relations to inegalitarian ones. That's just an sociological observation. Yeah. But then the flip side of that is actually the rigid binary, fixed gender binary doesn't fucking work because 7% of people are infertile, biologically infertile. Leave aside the actually, almost certainly, actually, somewhat greater numbers than the numbers who are across all ages trans, you know, are intersex. Exactly how many people are intersex to some degree or another, biologically intersex, that is, that they're XXY or they're have this or that developmental condition which results in they're coming out as hard to identify which biological sex they are at birth, etc., etc., etc. The numbers are what the numbers are is debatable. It depends what you count um, as being intersex for the purposes of how the numbers count up, but they are of the same scale as the number of people who are trans, and quite possibly bigger. But much bigger than that is the number of people who are infertile, biologically infertile, or who are gay men or who are lesbians. You know? So that the uh, presence of these various non-reproductive um, forms makes it actually seriously problematic to try and defend a rigid gender binarism. Mhm. Not that's not to say that there isn't a gender binary, but the gender binary is in connection, something which exists in connection with fertility. And the gender binary is a cultural outgrowth on the basis of biological fertility, and in some cases, actually involving an inversion. This is the argument which Camilla Power and her co-authors have made that the gender as a cultural phenomenon appears in the first instance as cultural inversion of the sex binary. Um, in connection with sex strike and lunarity and all ritual in hunter-gatherer societies and all those things. Mm. Okay, so I started with the maximum program, and I started with the maximum program, and I went on to this aspect that there's a problem with the biological idea of biological binaries. And the other side of it is the past. uh, and I've referred in the document very briefly to Dr. James Barry, who is uh, uh, female to male trans in the sense that Barry was a woman who lived as a man and rose to the heights of being Inspector General of Hospitals and was only discovered to be a woman at the point of death. Conversely, the Chevalier d'Eon um, was a man who, at least half part of the time, lived as a woman and had complicated political relationships with the French state, which was part of the reason why d'Eon lived as a woman. Um, uh, uh, Argued to be hermaphrodite, etc., um, anatomized, autopsied after death, proved to be a man. Um, and these are people who are existing in very late feudalism slash early capitalism in the late 18th, 19th century. We can guess, frankly, um, that because it's late, you're talking about the 18th, 19th century, that the means of discovery that people were living in the opposite gender to their birth sex was more readily available. Um, there's a person in the late 1300s who gets busted for prostitution, who is a man in Oxford, who is a man uh, dressed as a woman. We don't know whether this person was a drag queen, was homosexual, was permanently living as a woman. Um, we've got various saints' lives stories of people living as the opposite gender in Byzantium. I've referred to in the document to Betancourt's book, Byzantine Intersectionality, the chapter on this question. The point is simply actually, um, on the one hand, push at the issue of uh, biological sex is determinative from the point of view of the tech is moving quite rapidly towards the possibility of full transition, which at the moment doesn't exist. Mhm. Um, and on the other hand, that go back before the all-seeing eye of Sauron in the shape of the capitalist state. It's really quite likely that there are significant numbers of people who just live under the radar as members of the opposite sex, um, and it's not discovered. And on what grounds would socialists wish to prohibit that? Mhm. Um, it's not obvious to me. So that from the point of view of the maximum program, it seems to me that the underlying grounds of the oppression of trans people evaporate under conditions of, or can be made to evaporate under conditions of communism, under the circumstances of the maximum program, because we're rid of both the family as an economic institution, which I'll come back to in a minute, and the state as as a bureaucratic and force policing power standing over the society. Um, okay, so from the point of view of the therefore, I'm thinking in terms of the maximum program. I'm not saying this is the dictatorship of the proletariat can immediately solve this problem. I don't think that's right. Why not? Mhm. Step two, um, it has to be a question of the maximum program because uh, the minimum program is a program for the dictatorship of the proletariat, for the seizure of power by the proletariat, opening up what will probably be quite rapid at first, but nonetheless prolonged transition to socialism. The reason why prolonged transition to socialism is because we've tested to destruction in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, um, Cuba, China, the idea of forced collectivization of peasant property, of but for that matter, of small businesses. Mhm. So the consequence is that what we're going to get, if the working class takes over political power, it will get political power and boot the capitalist class out of the means of its current means of having political power. But it will remain the case that there continued to be a mixed economy with a substantial market sector, with a substantial petty bourgeoisie. And the consequence of that as well, we have to understand that as Evgeny Preobrazhensky argued and as Hillel Tikhtin argued more recently, it's contradictory. It's not everything is at once wonderful. The partial socialization dislocates the capitalist system of incentives. But because it's partial socialization, a fully socialist system of incentives is not at once coming into being. So it's a complex and conflictual and fairly prolonged process of change. Now, in the context of this, the next step. General equilibrium is false. This is marginalist theory of general equilibrium, not just marginalist theory, but also Adam Smith and before him Bernard Mandeville's Fable of the Bees. General equilibrium theory is false. And the consequence of general equilibrium theory is false is that it's also the case that methodological individualism argued by Weber and others in early 20th century Germany is false. Capitalism, therefore, automatically involves both market institutions and state institutions. And indeed, actually, when we look at, quote, state formation and state growth and stuff like that, it is perfectly clear that the bureaucratic coercive state under capitalism is massively more extensive and massively more invasive of people's personal lives than is the case of any feudal political regime, including the church. Or for that matter, of the Roman Empire or the ancient Chinese Empire. Precisely because marketization does not lead to equilibrium, it leads to instability. Because marketization leads to instability, which we can see every day in the wild gyrations and fluctuations of stock markets, money markets, commodities, futures markets, and so on and so forth. The opposite, the capitalist markets require their opposite, and their opposite at one end is the state. The nation is the language in which we talk about the state, though it's actually quite misleading to say that capitalists, so FX, the United Kingdom is a state of at least four national groups, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ulster. If we call Ulster a national group, which is a sort of, hey, okay, one way or another. The Netherlands is less than a national state because part of the Flemish-speaking, Dutch-speaking country is Flemish-speaking and is part of Belgium rather than being part of the Netherlands, while on the other hand, Belgium is partly a part of the Netherlands and partly part of France. France, like Britain, includes Brittany and Corsica, both of which have significant separatist movements. The United States is not a nation at all, but a purely constitutional ideological state. Singapore is not a nation state, and so on and so on and so on. Capitalist states are generally constitution states rather than nation states, but nonetheless, we think about it in terms of the nation. It's the state which we're really talking about. The other side of it is the family, that it ain't the case that one can comfortably live solely on the basis of, though there's much more ability to live just on the basis of market interactions in capitalism than there is in pre-capitalist society, it is nonetheless the case that certainly, again, when you get to the point where there are kids, as opposed to the singleton uh, working, even the singleton working, what are you going to do when you fall ill with something which isn't serious enough to actually go to hospital with, but which you could really do with help about? You know? The family is just as much significant as an economic institution as um, the state is, and they are significant as an economic institution for exactly the same reason. Now, the dynamics of capitalist family formation in capitalism, we lose the arranged marriage system, which is characteristic of both classical antiquity and the Middle Ages. You know? And that, I say, it's clear that it extends all the way down. We know that it goes. It's not just the tops who do arranged marriage. It's also the peasantry and the artisan classes who do arranged marriage. And we can see arranged marriage actually being done by people who migrant communities where people have relatively recently moved out of peasant or artisan society overseas. Um, Capitalism, we lose the arranged marriage system, and instead we get a marriage marketplace, basically in the form of heterosexual cruising grounds, um, in the form of discos, blah blah blah, clubs, blah blah, all of this stuff. Yeah. So that this is a competitive marketplace, and it's in the context of this. What we have is the processes of formation of competitive heterosexuality. Mhm. And it's the competitive formation of heterosexuality driven by the formation of marriage through market processes, of heterosexual relations through market processes, which drives both negations of heterosexuality of a whole variety of different forms, but also actually the phenomenon of queer bashing, which is an instance of the performance of heterosexual masculinity by queer bashing. And it's queer bashing is one of the main forms of victimization of trans people. Flip side of it, actually, the state. I said the state, the bureaucratic coercive state, expands dramatically under capitalism. Mhm. The fact that the bureaucratic coercive state expands dramatically under capitalism creates the eye of Sauron trying to look at everyone and identify which gender they are or all the other stuff, but also the role of doctors as state gatekeepers, of social workers as state gatekeepers, as controlling access to transition. Um, uh, so the dynamics, the point is that we are not concerned with simple, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie produces this. It's the dynamics of market society, and the dynamics of market society will persist and be overcome and wither away. The state will wither away, the market will wither away in the transition to communism after the creation of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And it's for that reason we need the maximum program. Trans liberation is not the only reason we need the whole raft of issues. Women's liberation, we need the maximum program. Lesbian and gay liberation, we need the maximum program. A vast array of things we need. It's not good enough to just have a minimum program on its own, but we need both the minimum program and the maximum program. Secondly, in relation to the minimum program, actually most of the issues which are minimum program issues which affect trans people are shared with everybody else. Thus, for example, we want decent health services, free at the point of need, mm, publicly controlled and publicly funded. We want to get rid of the witch hunting operations of the capitalist press. It's no good trying to imagine that you can overcome the witch hunting operations of the capitalist press in relation to trans people while leaving intact the witch hunting operations of the capitalist press in relation to the smear, fake anti-Semitism smear, or any other, or the endless Hitler stories about the latest opponent of US foreign policy. Mhm. The witch hunting character of the capitalist press and witch hunt is the capitalist media is an institutional arrangement under which the voice of the proprietor is amplified by advertising funding. Mhm. And applied for his political purposes, which is why, of course, Rupert Murdoch is trying to make sure that control of News International passes to Lachlan, who he can trust to carry on Rupert's political purposes, rather than going to the family as he promised it to go to the family, etc. Okay, the one thing which has been offered as being minimum program uh, demand for trans people is legal gender recognition. But the reality is that legal gender recognition fails. It fails to deal with the medical aspect, but it also actually immediately, inherently sets up the flat conflict which the gender critical feminists exploit, because the nature of legal gender recognition, either it's you have to go through a whole series of hoops in order to get your gender recognition, which in effect is violently oppressive to trans people, or alternatively you don't, and then it becomes a toy for whoever the hell, whatever the hell provocateurs or whatever like to play with it. It's that um, the problem essentially is the attempt to get unity on single issue with the Liberals, in this case, produces you go down with the Liberals, which is what's happened to the Scottish National Party over gender recognition. Mm. Okay, so that's so I don't therefore have an awful lot to say about, or if anything to say about the minimum program. I'm just going to say three things about the general theoretical issues, uh, two of which I have actually said in the stuff which I've written, and one of which I haven't. The two of which I've actually said in the stuff which I've written. The first is against intersectionality. The problem with intersectionality is that it supposes it's anti-class. It's a ultra theorization of the People's Front in the form of the United States version of the People's Front, small unpopular fronts on the basis that class is represented by the right-wing leadership of the trade unions, and you can't raise race or gender issues in the trade unions because that would be disturbing the class front. And gender is represented by the right-wing leadership of the liberal women's movement, the liberal leadership of the women's movement, and you can't raise class or race issues there because that would disturb the unity of the women's movement. And race is represented by whatever the hell mountebanks hold themselves out as the representatives of the black community, or the sub community, the West Indian community, the African community, the South Asian community, Hindu community, the Muslim, etc., etc., etc. It's endless processes of division. So reject the method of intersectionality is a first step. Secondly, reject Butler, Foucault, and so on. These are essentially theories, idealistic theories, according to which we are to reject uh, Marxist materialism as far as it relates to sexuality, which was Foucault in the 1970s, as far as it relates to gender, which was Butler's argument in the 1990s, and which is then adopted by an enormous number of left trans writers. The reality is you cannot corral the rejection of materialism into the say the space that we can reject materialism as far as gender is concerned, but not reject materialism as far as the dynamics of the economy is concerned. If Foucault is right, then Marx's claims about the economy and about historical materialism and all that stuff are wrong. In reality, I think it's clear from the historical work which has been done since Foucault wrote that Foucault was wrong. And it's clear, I cannot remember the guy's name now. There's a book called Foucault and Neoliberalism, which demonstrates that actually Foucault is part of the neoliberal movement of critique of Marxism from what became Eurocommunism and then straight neoliberalism. Butler is still a leftist as far as the question of Palestine is concerned, but it's nonetheless the case. You cannot say, "Oh, the ideological overdetermines the material," and at the same time have any sort of serious explanation of the economic, or for that matter, of the return of class after class has been supposedly marginalized as and I've just been reading a guy called Duncan Kennedy, who, among other things, argues for the marginalization of class. But class returns, and it returns, in fact, unfortunately for us, in the form that the left having abandoned class, class becomes a trope for the right. Mhm. Um, Finally, I'm just going to say something very briefly about limits of social reproduction theory, because a significant amount of the um, leftist trans liberation stuff has been on the basis of social reproduction theory. Now, social reproduction theory is essentially a theory constructed in the 1970s on the basis of, originally constructed in the 1970s on the basis of how things were in the 1970s. That capitalism as such corrals and separates social reproduction processes from production processes. And production is masculine, reproduction is feminine. Mhm. Now, the what we can see empirically is wrong with this is since the theory was constructed, we've seen a radical feminization of the workforce globally. Not just in the advanced capitalist countries, but globally. So an awful lot of just ordinary production is feminine. Mhm. Um, Going along with that, a whole load of the ideological forms. Well, this now I'm talking simply about the United States and Britain. I'm not sure how far it is, but the gym. We have the women's exercise. We have Spartan conception of femininity as opposed to an Athenian conception of femininity in which women ought to be in the house and not outside the house and white and soft. Instead, we have women who are running around and taking exercise and so on. That's an ideological, very superficial ideological form, but the superficial ideological form reflects uh, part in an indirect way the general phenomenon of the feminization of the workforce. If we think about it as substructural problems with the theory, if we think about Marx on reproduction and production, uh, reproduction for Marx is the element of production which is necessary for reproduction for the society to carry on. And what it goes beyond reproduction is the surplus value producing element of production. So that reproduction is not just what women do in the home in connection with kids and housework and stuff like that in the traditional family view. It's also the blokes who are digging holes in the road in order to mend water mains, the people who are building and rebuilding houses, the people who are manufacturing cars, so far as the cars they're manufacturing and to replace old and busted cars, and blah, 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 uh, uh, across the whole of the economy. Why is social reproduction theory fall into this trap? The answer is that it was trying to give an explanation of the oppression of women, which was not vulnerable to the Eurocommunists' critiques of Engels. So that in the 1970s, you had a Marxist feminism, which was Engelsian Marxist feminism, primarily promoted by guys in the US Socialist Workers' Party, but also by more traditional elements in the Communist parties. Mm-hmm. But then you had radical critique of that, on the one hand, by the radical feminists who argued that the oppression of women is substructural to class, which may well be true, but it's not, doesn't. The oppression of women may be substructural to class, but then that's like the guys who are repairing the bridge or trying to deal with the railway bridge in Oxford have extreme difficulty because they can't get properly at the substructure of the bridge without taking the bridge off, which would involve them shutting the railway down for however long it took. And their attempts to get at the substructure without taking the structure off in order to get at the substructure don't bloody work. And the same goes with the radical feminists' idea that you could deal with the substructural oppression of women without dealing with the superstructural capitalist state. Lisa Vogel and social reproduction theory was part of a movement more generally to try and construct a theory of the oppression of women which would not engage historical materialism and not fall into, quote, Engelsism, unquote, but would instead grow immediately out of the internal dynamics of capitalism as such. And that the problem with it then is that the result is, as I said, that it on the one hand it places the oppression of women insufficiently deep in the structure of class society. On the other hand, it places it too deep in the structure of capitalist society, so that the ability of capitalism as such to move radically in relation to the family, in relation to the proportion of women employed in formal employment, etc., 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 it becomes the case that capitalism seems to need more conservatism than it actually needs. And then the flip side of it is that feminism of one sort and another, but equally gender resistance, appears to be more radical or more of a radical underpinning of the capitalist system than is in fact the case, with the consequence that you overemphasize the radicalness of what you're doing and what you can achieve. So I've spent a bit longer than I said I would, but that's it.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mike. As I've posted in the chat, at this point we will cease live streaming.